So now we're all set up for Azure and we're ready to deploy our application, and just make sure you've copied this connection string into your clipboard, and let's head back over to VS Code and we'll make use of that connection string in our app-settings.json file. And what we'll do is we'll just update our default connection here, and I'll just paste our new connection string in that we get from Azure, and we've got the address of our SQL server. Yours is obviously going to be different to mine. And we need to provide the user ID, and in this case it's going to be app user. And the very temporary password I'm using at the moment is capital P O $W0RD, and we can keep the rest of these the same. What we also need to do is head over to our startup class, and all we need to do in here is swap MySQL for SQL Server. So we'll say use SQL Server, and in theory this would be good enough for us to test our application locally and use our SQL Server in Azure, because we've opened up our firewall to allow that particular connection. And let's go ahead and do this, and this will actually create our database on the Azure SQL Server as well and seed the data into it. So let's just start our application just to make sure that we can still run our application in production mode with our Azure SQL connection string. Now, it's important you've opened a firewall to your particular IP address for this to be able to work. So what I'll do is I'll just say .NET Run and P and API and press return. And this takes a bit longer than normal, obviously, because now we're going out to the Azure SQL database, but the application should be running, and we can go ahead and browse to this as well. And I'll just go back to the home page, and we're still browsing on localhost, so we still have our JWT token inside here. So I'm just going to go to the activities, and we should find that everything's fine, and we're still able to access our application and do various things. Obviously it's going to be a bit slower because our database is now no longer running on the same server, or our development machine is now hosted far away. But our application should still be working, just a little bit slower than it was. And what we should also find is if we go to back to the Azure portal, and if we go to back to our resource group and click on our SQL database, then we do have this query editor in here, and we can preview our database. Now, bizarrely, you also need to have your firewall open to your IP address for this as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in my password in here and click OK. And what we should be able to see is the tables inside here, and we've now got all of our activities related tables created inside here as well. So that part's working, which is good. And what we can do now is actually deploy our application to Azure. So what I'm going to do, I'll just stop the application once again. And what we want to do to help us out with this is we want to go and get the Azure extension for VS Code, and what we can get from this is the Azure App Service. And this is really good. This one gives us a way to very easily deploy our code to Azure from VS Code. So I'm just going to install this. And once this is installed, this gives us this Azure tab on the left-hand side. And what we can do is sign into Azure from here. And this will open up a browser window, and you'll sign in via the browser. So I'm just doing that off screen. And once you're signed in, you'll see your account inside this particular window. Now, I'm on this pay-as-you-go account, so that's fine. That's what I see inside here. And what we can do inside here is we can go inside our app service. In this case, it's the reactivities. And we can see various bits of information about our application. And when we deploy our code, it's going to live inside the files inside here, and we'll be able to see them. But first of all, what I want to do first of all is actually rebuild my application, just to make sure everything's clean before we go ahead and publish it. And we can see the HTML page we get that we see when we browse to our app service earlier on. So that's pretty good. But we obviously want to deploy our own code to this. And as I said, before I do this, I'm just going to do a couple of things, because Azure is very fussy about what we deploy. So First of all, I'm just going to run .NET build, just to make sure there's no errors in my code and it builds successfully, and that's fine. The next thing I'm going to do is just go to the API and publish directory, and I'm just going to delete this in its entirety and move it to trash. And I'm just going to go back and find the command we used earlier to publish our application. And the reason I've deleted this file is this output command is a bit buggy. It doesn't overwrite the contents. It actually pushes it into a new publish folder under there. So I still want to use the output directory because it's just convenient to see it easily. And if we leave this off, then this puts it inside a nest of folders, and we have to dig quite deep to get into our publish directory. But deleting this works fine. So I'm just going to republish the application again. And we can see our publish directory there, so that's good. And the next step we need to do is get the code inside here up to Azure so that we can then run and see our application. So I'm just going to click back on the Azure extension, and I'm just going to click on this upload button which deploys to our web app. So I'm just going to click on this, and we want to select the folder to deploy, so I'm going to click on browse, and we want to go inside our API folder and click on the publish folder, and in Explorer or Finder you want to see all of these files, and this is what we're going to publish to Azure. So I'm just going to click on open, and then we select the web app we want to deploy this to. Now mine's called Reactivities, yours will be called something slightly different, so I'm just going to click on this. Then we'll get a warning asking if we're sure we want to deploy to Reactivities. This will overwrite any previous deployment, and I'm okay with this, so I'm going to click on deploy, and then it's going to start deploying. I'm just going to click on the skip filler warning. And if we check the output window, we can see what it's up to. It's creating a zip package, and it starts the deployment. And this might take a minute or two, so once again, I'm just going to pause the video and come back once this is complete. And this should have completed successfully, and we've got the option to browse to the website now. And we can also see all of the files that have been deployed to the Azure web application. So let's just go back to our browser, and I'm just going to go back to the page where we're running our application. I'm just going to hit refresh, and what we should find is that we see our application running and working on our server. I'm getting a warning about my session has expired, but that's probably from earlier testing to this same application. But what we should be able to do is log in and click bob@test.com and the password. Log into our site, and it should be running, and we should be able to browse, and it's pretty sprightly because I can scroll down and see all of the activities. I should be able to click on the filters and it loads up the next events. I should be able to go to my profile, and I just want to check the photos and make sure that we can add an image, and I'll just drag in another image, make some adjustments and click upload. And we get the image uploaded successfully, and we can browse around, and our application is working as we would expect on Azure. And let's just go back to the security headers IO and just see what result we get for Azure. So I'm just going to paste in this, and this is running on HTTPS now. So if you were getting a B before, we should hopefully get an A now. In fact, we won't, because there's one more tweak we need to make. But if I click scan and actually put the correct address in and click scan, then we get a B grade. And the reason we're getting a B grade is because of the strict transport security header hasn't been applied for this particular site. But all of our other request headers are still in place, and we just need to deal with this one. And what we'll take a look at next, just to finish off, because we want to enable the HSTS in our application for Azure because we're using HTTPS here. But also we want to take our configuration for our site, which includes our Cloudinary settings, our connection string, and we want to move that outside of our app settings.json and move that into the Azure application settings so our configuration can be read from there. instead of a file that lives as part of our application. And we'll take a look at that next.